remember, this is a man who's seen not one but two authoritarian regimes collapse around him. First East Germany and then the Soviet Union in 1991. He knows how even regimes that look very tough can prove very fragile. And I think that's probably, again, my guess, what metaphorically keeps him up at night.
So, Mark, what has Prigozhin been up to since arriving in Belarus?
Well, the interesting thing is he's been setting up a new camp to replace the one that, frankly, the Ministry of Defence has closed down. But he also gave an address which was fortuitously videoed and then released on social media, in which he addressed a few hundred of his men. He said, well, we're here for a while. We might go back to Ukraine if circumstances change. But the main thing is, he did not in the least sound like a cowed man. He didn't sound as if he was feeling that he'd been exiled or ostracized. Quite the opposite. It was all a case of brave new worlds and new things to address. So I think it's fairly clear that Prigozhin still feels that he's a player, even if, shall we say, in a slightly different game.
And Prigozhin's fighters were invited to fight for Russia and Ukraine, which they were up for, but Prigozhin vetoed it. Surely that sends quite a conflicting message to people in the Kremlin or in Russia's military that he had the ability to do that.
Well, it's interesting because I think what the Kremlin is trying to do, and it's a difficult square to circle, is they're still trying to give the sense that, look, the Wagner fighters, now they're noble, upright patriots. It's that they were misled into their mutiny. And therefore, I think the reason why Putin allowed it to be known that he made this offer, that they could actually fight under a different field commander, but that Prigozhin had vetoed the idea, even though many of the other field commanders had seemed perfectly keen to accept that, is he's still trying to convey that impression. And I think what we're going to see is a long-term campaign to essentially woo Wagner fighters, who, let's be honest, they might have been fine fighting in Ukraine. They might not be quite so keen about ending up in Mali or the Central African Republic or wherever. Anyway, woo them back to get them to join the regular military or another mercenary army. So I think this is a bit of a long game. But on the other hand, the very fact that Prigozhin was willing and able to veto it still shows that he himself is still definitely a rather bullish character on the scene.
Mm. And Prigozhin really seems to have gotten away with his mutiny. What kind of upset has that caused in Russia?
It's definitely not going down well. I mean, look, we shouldn't assume that Prigozhin has totally got away with it. He's essentially losing his businesses inside Russia. He still keeps the international element, particularly in Africa, which is, let's be honest, both lucrative as well as politically significant. But nonetheless, already predators are swooping round other elements of his Concord Group, which is his overall managing company. So, it's not quite so clear that he's got off scot-free. But still, especially within both the military and the commentators who support the military, there is a lot of anger. We shouldn't remember that more than a dozen Russian pilots got killed by Wagner when they tried to essentially do their job and stop the mercenaries in their mutiny. And that seems to have been completely swept under the carpet. And what's more, at the very time that Prigozhin looks as if he's got off scot-free, at the same time we have the spectacle of generals being sacked, or in some cases disappearing, presumably into interrogation centres somewhere, and not being known about. So I think from the military's point of view, there is that definite sense that they're being treated as the scapegoats, and they're angry.
Mm. And you've written that Surovikin is in detention for apparently knowing about the mutiny beforehand. What does his absence from the field, from Russia's military, mean for Russia's capability in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, realistically, Surovikin was not, in a primary command role. I mean, he had basically, he was the commander who was brought in really over the winter period. And he adopted, frankly, rather effective defensive strategy. And if one looks at the moment, I mean, the defensive lines that are so effectively holding back the Ukrainian counteroffensive, they're still informally known as the Surovikin lines, because he was the one who built them. But still, from Putin's point of view, he wasn't sufficiently aggressive, and that's why he was removed from his position. I mean, he's still commander of the aerospace forces, and Chief of the General Staff Gerasimov took over overall control of the Ukraine operation. So, this is not actually going to have, at the moment at least, a direct impact on how the war is being fought. It's more about what it says when one of your, admittedly exceedingly nasty, but nonetheless exceedingly competent officers a man who, frankly, was regarded by most as the front runner to be the next chief of the general staff. Not only is he demoted and out of sight, but by all accounts, he's going through probably what is a sort of rather aggravated form of interrogation. And I must admit, part of me wonders if the reason we're not seeing Surovikin now is because they're waiting for the bruises to heal. None of this is good for the overall cohesion of the officer corps. They do feel that they are being metaphorically and sometimes actually kicked around because of other people's blunders and mistakes.
And I mean, it's funny that, Putin has detained or kind of hidden away some of these generals, including Surovikin, who's well known for his atrocities in Syria, for not being tough enough. I mean, the next general that would be put in his place, I can only imagine how aggressive that kind of figure would be.
I think what you've got to understand is, look, the Russian military is not sadistic for the sheer hell of it, in the main. I mean, in terms of how it approaches, it's more that it actually has a very, very ruthlessly pragmatic approach. And the fact of the matter is, urban warfare is hard. Leveling a city like Aleppo or indeed Grozny back in Chechnya during the Second Chechen War at home, that's a lot easier, quite frankly. And if civilian casualties happen, well, so be it. It's kind of collateral damage. So this is the thing about Surovikin. Absolutely, there's no question but that when he felt that brutal tactics were needed, he would do so. But that didn't mean to say he would be aggressive just for the sake of being aggressive. And I think particularly it's not so much that whoever is next in that particular hot seat is going to feel, oh my God, I have to be aggressive. It's almost this sense of capriciousness, that your job is not just simply to carry out your orders, but to almost to do so in a way that predicts what Putin is going to be wanting tomorrow. And again, I think this is the thing. Unlike so many other leaders, including, it has to be said, after the first shock of war, Joseph Stalin, Putin is clearly still micromanaging the war effort. And this is a man who has no military experience at all of any note. And from the point of view of the generals, they want to be able to actually, if they're going to be fighting this war, they want to fight this war the way they know how. Putin's not letting them.
And you've written in the Sunday Times that Gerasimov and Shoigu are increasingly becoming lame ducks. Who do we see poised to replace them?
Well, I mean, on one level, it's almost one would say, who on earth will be stupid enough to want to replace them? I mean, these are not at the moment exactly great jobs, given what's happening in the war and what's likely to continue to happen. But the point is that, first of all, whenever there are positions of power, someone will want them. And it may well be that the Kremlin, will, as it were, make offers that can't be refused. In terms of defense minister, I mean, this is essentially a political job. There are some names in the frame. One of them, for example, is Alexei Dumin, who's currently governor of the region of Tula. But the point is, this was a guy who back in the day was one of Putin's personal bodyguards. So he has a close relationship with Putin, and Putin trusts him. And that's the important thing. Frankly, Putin values loyalty more than competence. But Dumin also has military experience. He's ex-special forces. So there is that sense that he sort of hits the sweet spot. He's a civilian politician who used to be a special forces soldier. So that he's probably the sort of the main figure in line to be defense minister. But of course, we don't know. In terms of chief of the general staff, well, as I said, Surovikin had been the real, front runner by a mile. With him, I think it's fair to say, pretty much out of the picture. We're getting interesting signs that a general by the name of Mikhail Cheplinsky, again, very aggressive, hard-driving paratrooper. Well, his backers are more or less suggesting that in practice he's already running operations in Ukraine, with the implication, and he could do the rest of Gerasimov's job without any trouble. So, he's the only figure who is actually really breaking ranks to show that he's interested. But again, when it comes down to it, usually the defense minister gets to pick his own chief of the general staff. So if Dumin comes in to replace the current defense minister Shoigu, he may go for Cheplinsky, or he may want a chief of the general staff who is less likely to be forceful and have his own point of view. It may well be that he's rather a yes man. We'll have to wait and see.
Could we see this these troubles within the Russian military and within the Kremlin itself kind of trickling down to the Russians that are on the front line, maybe causing some discontent or maybe having them disobey command even?
I mean, let's be honest, people don't fight because of the generals. They fight essentially to save their own lives, but also so as not to, in effect, let the side down in front of their mates, their squad mates, their platoon mates, and so forth. Actually, it's a very primal kind of motivator. So on one level, we certainly haven't seen either the Prigozhin mutiny or the subsequent troubles manifest itself on the front line. However, that said, the quality and the competence of the officer corps is also crucial in keeping soldiers motivated. And if we find that, in fact, down to the level of the majors and the captains and the lieutenants, the people who are really there on the front line, if they start getting disillusioned, it may well be that they'll be less likely to keep holding the line and such like. That's, as I say, I think that's still a certain way down the line at the moment. We're not there yet. At the moment, very much the interesting thing is the discontent is actually the people at the top of the system. And that has a problem in the sense of it begins to kind of throw grit into the cogwheels of the military machine in terms of the overall preparations and the grand strategy. And if that starts to go badly, well, look, nothing succeeds like success and nothing is as bad as defeat. If the Russians start basically not being able to hold the line and start suffering defeats, that's when we'll probably see demoralization begin to move down the chain of command.
What does this kind of fracturing of the military elite, what consequences could this have for Putin himself?
And there's a lot of talk about potential for coups from security apparatus and the like. Frankly, I wouldn't complain if it happened, but I don't think we're near there yet. Especially because, on the whole, this is a system which is designed to be fairly coup-proof. There's multiple different military and paramilitary and security agencies that are all busy watching each other and are there to check each other. Wagner, in some ways, could do what it did precisely because it was such an outlier. It was not something that they were really geared for addressing. So I don't think we're likely to see coups. What we are seeing is first of all, just a general spread of demoralization within the elite, within the people whom Putin depends upon to actually run his country for him. And at some point, there will be the next crisis. And when that happens, again, how well or how badly will Putin respond? And what tends to happen is each of these crises leaves him weaker. And at some point, it might be the next crisis, it might be the third one after that, who knows? But at some point, it's likely that actually the elite will begin to start making different decisions. They will begin to think that the risks in doing something about Putin finally outweigh the risks in just keeping your head down and doing nothing. And when it comes to that, I think the role of the military will be crucial, not because they'll necessarily topple Putin, but precisely because they won't support Putin. When it comes down to it, from the coup plotters' point of view, they want to be in a position where if they file into his office and say it's time for you to go, when he picks up the phone, either the phone's been switched off or whoever answers the phone is not willing to come and support him. So I think that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a hollowing out of Putin's support base. We thought that his bedrock of his regime was his control of the military and the security apparatus. Now we have reason to begin to doubt that.
Are you of the Western consensus that what will win this war for Ukraine might not be the soldiers on the front line, however heroic they may be, but a change of power inside the Kremlin might be what decides this war, kind of like you may have just hinted?
I'm going to totally sort of ruin my answer to your question by making it more complex than perhaps it would need to be. Look, we've got to understand that when we talk about peace and victory for Ukraine, there's almost two things we're talking about. One is just an end to the shooting, which is maybe driving the Russians out of all the occupied territories or otherwise reaching some kind of peace. But even if every Russian soldier left every square inch of Ukraine, that in itself does not end the war. It just simply moves the front line to the national borders. And even if there's not shooting going on, there are all kinds of other ways in which Russia can undermine, damage, and generally mess with Ukraine. So there's also, you might say, reaching a true peace in which Russia thoroughly accepts Ukraine's, frankly, its right to exist. And my suspicion is that actually, if there's going to be a change in regime, it's going to be in between those two pieces. It may well be that the failure of Putin's war on the battlefield is what finally brings Putin down. It's what finally forces people to actually remove him from office. And that will unlock the chance for a genuine peace. Because one thing I think we can say is Putin is not a trustworthy interlocutor. I cannot see any situation in which the Ukrainians could believe anything Putin offers. And therefore, I think it will have to be a new regime which can essentially blame everything that went badly on Putin, which has the chance to negotiate a real peace. So I think there's an interesting kind of feedback mechanism. The weaker the Putin regime becomes, the less likely it is to win on the battlefield. When it finally loses on the battlefield, that may well bring down the Putin regime. And that is what actually can unlock the door to a genuine, meaningful peace.
Do you think Putin's been too soft on Prigozhin? Could we see him rise again and have any semblance of power, or will he remain in Belarus, likely quite anxious?
Well, I'd imagine he's anxious. I mean, despite his bullish rhetoric, he must know that Putin is not exactly the sort to forgive and forget, and that in Putin's canon, personal treachery is the worst sin of all. And if we think of the times when he's been even willing to risk diplomatic incidents, such as in the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London and the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal, again, these are people who we feel absolutely had basically betrayed him or the motherland. So I think in that context, Prigozhin will still be in his sights. Now, in some ways, he has a certain window of opportunity for two reasons. One is that the Kremlin clearly wants to hold on to Wagner's international operations, above all in Africa. They're lucrative and they provide political leverage. So in some ways, because Prigozhin is really central to that, they want to give him the chance to actually keep operating that. But also, because there was a deal, in some ways, if tomorrow sort of something happens to Prigozhin, and we assume that it's because of the Russian state, in some ways, next time Putin would never be able to make a deal. I mean, he has to appear to be willing to stick to it. So I suspect there's a window of opportunity in which Prigozhin gets a chance to re-show his loyalty, his utility. And maybe in a year's time, when the dust has settled and people aren't necessarily talking about Prigozhin quite so much, then maybe he'll drink from the wrong cup of tea or fall out of an unfortunate high-level window or something like that. But as I said, I think that's a little bit further down the line. But I don't think Prigozhin's a threat now. It's interesting, not just, yes, he's got his troops, but they're now in Belarus. But one of the key things we did see is the Defense Ministry took back all the heavy equipment that they'd given Wagner. So the tanks, the artillery pieces and such like. 15,000 guys is, which is at the very high end of what he may have. That's a not inconsiderable force. But if it's 15,000 guys just with their rifles and without all the rest of the kit, and Belarus isn't going to rearm them, well, they're a very, very different kind of threat proposition. So I don't actually think Prigozhin poses that kind of a threat again.
I guess if we walk back to before the mutiny, could Prigozhin have become kind of a General Zhukov type figure? He was the Soviet commander who recaptured Nazi Berlin. Was his popularity pre-mutiny a genuine threat to Putin, or is this all just kind of a creation of Putin's own paranoia?
Oh, it's more than just Putin's paranoia. It was interesting that there was this popularity for Prigozhin, and it's on one level hard to believe. Prigozhin is this thuggish, opportunist, embezzling businessman who rose on Putin's coattails, who had been the subject of so many scandals. For example, one of his companies provided food for a lot of schools in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and there were hundreds of lawsuits about the subpar quality of the food that was being given to kids. This is not exactly the sort of man of which popular heroes are made. And this is also a guy who not only recruited from the prison camp system as an ex-con himself, but also approved of the point when a deserter was murdered by having a sledgehammer slammed into his head. But the point is, I think the popularity we saw, like, for example, the crowds that were applauding Prigozhin and Wagner when they pulled out of the city of Rostov-on-Don, was not so much for Prigozhin the man. They were for the fact that Prigozhin represented something. He represented two things, really. One is, the tough, no-nonsense fighter who was actually able to secure some genuine victories in this miserable and largely unsuccessful war. But also the man who was willing to stand up against the powers that be and tell it like it is and so forth. And I think it shows how far the Russians are aware that they're being lied to and are frankly not happy with this whole situation, even though they can't really express it themselves, because this is, after all, a vicious authoritarian regime. So the sight of someone who's willing to actually call out military high command, to say that you're being lied to about the number of casualties and why this war was fought, that was very refreshing. So, as I said, I think it's not so much that Prigozhin himself was a threat to Putin. It's just that he gave Putin a scare by showing actually how far ordinary Russians are not behind this war and do not believe in all the nonsense that is being put out on state media.
I feel like now, in the aftermath of that mutiny, we see Putin installing these really uncharismatic Russian generals in this kind of suspected reshuffle. Surely that does nothing to convince this increasingly wary Russian population of the war effort.
No, it doesn't. And I think this is the problem that Putin finds himself in. But this is a man, after all, as I mentioned, who basically values loyalty over competence and is above all risk averse. He's terrified of the thought of a threat. Remember, this is a man who's seen not one but two authoritarian regimes collapse around him. First East Germany and then the Soviet Union in 1991. He knows how even regimes that look very tough can prove very fragile. And I think that's probably, again, my guess, what metaphorically keeps him up at night. So, I mean, in that context, absolutely. You mentioned someone like General Marshal Zhukov. Um, you know, one of the reasons why Stalin was actually, on the one hand, very appreciative of Zhukov's military prowess, but at the same time quite wary of Zhukov, was exactly the idea that a military hero is someone who could actually pose a political threat. So I think the fact that Putin is willing to surround himself as far as possible with mediocrities and non-entities is politically useful for him, but bad for the country and for the war effort. But it also absolutely transmits to the public. They are looking for some reason to be enthused, and at the moment they're not getting it. People are increasingly, not watching national news and so forth. They don't want to hear about the war in the main. And in this respect, given that life is getting harder for the majority of Russians, real wages are falling, the civilian economy is under increasing pressure. In these circumstances, it actually means that there's a considerable protest potential. That if there's no one to enthuse them for the regime and for the war, then it leaves them open to be enthused by someone who's against.
And you mentioned there that Putin has seen two collapses of the regime in his lifetime. Do you think that he could be anticipating a third? I mean, you know, if he gets taken out of power in some way, or, however this war ends, could we see, as he has warned, Russia being broken up into separate states to this kind of huge Russia that he's in charge of now becoming a lot smaller?
I mean, I don't think that we're going to see a fragmentation of the Russian Federation, not least because decades and centuries of migration and so forth mean that even in many of the republics which are notionally belong to non-Russian ethnicities, in practice the Russians are either a majority or a plurality. So I really don't think that's likely. But the interesting thing is, clearly I think Putin is worried generally about a kind of a collapse of the power of the regime. But also it's a card he plays. It was interesting that, for example, in his address immediately after the start of the mutiny, he raised the spectre of smuta, which means time of troubles. And it reflects a period back when the 16th century Tsar, 17th century Tsar Ivan the Terrible had died. And there was a period of dynastic crisis, hunger, foreign invasions and such like. So he's more or less saying, actually, things could be worse after me. So don't assume that actually any change is going to be for the better. So on the one hand, I think it's something he genuinely worries about, but it's also one of the cards he plays to his own people and also to us, saying you might think that it's better the devil you know.
The last point I wanted to touch on was for the US for a second. If Trump gets back into power in the upcoming general election, which is a big if, what will this conflict look like? Could the US relations with Russia change that significantly?
I mean, in practice, I suspect the answer is no. For two reasons. One of which is actually, if one looks at the first Trump presidency, sure, Donald Trump said a lot of nice things about Putin. One has to say, he's never met an autocrat he didn't like. But this didn't really translate into policy. Quite the opposite, actually. US policy at the end of the Trump presidency was tougher on Russia than it's been at any point since the end of the Cold War. And the reason for that is that Congress essentially took over policy rather than leaving it in the hands of the White House. And that says about a second thing. When it comes down to it, Trump is interested in Trump. and he will not spend political capital on what he thinks are lost causes. So, he may talk a lot, but if he is convinced that in fact the Ukrainians are going to be the winners, then he will probably not get in the way. And certainly that is a lot of policy. We saw in the fringes of the recent NATO summit in Vilnius and in the preparations to the next NATO summit, which will be in Washington before the elections, is almost an attempt to try and ensure that by the time Trump becomes president, momentum is so heavily in the Ukrainians' way that Trump will go along with it rather than anything else. The only other point I'd make, though, is precisely the possibility that policy might change is one of these things that keep the Russians going. Putin's policy now is essentially, he knows he's not going to win the war on the battlefield. He regards the weak link as being the West. Because if it wasn't for the billions of pounds, dollars, and euros that Ukraine gets every month in terms of both military assistance and financial aid, then it will be very, very difficult to maintain the war. And Ukraine would probably have to reach some kind of ugly peace with Russia that will give Putin concessions that he would then call a victory. So his hope is really, all he has to do is outlast us. He's sure that just over the horizon, the West is going to tire of supporting Ukraine. The West is going to be unable or unwilling to continue to spend that money. And therefore, this gives him his reason. I mean, his strategy really just simply to hold on and think that he wins by not losing. And one of the elements of that is whenever there's any hint of a division in the West, it's fastened on by the Kremlin as proof that, oh yes, any minute now. But still, I think from their point of view, there is this hope that a Trump presidency might well mean the end of this willingness to continue to bankroll Ukraine. So long as Putin thinks that Trump might win and that President Trump might be willing to change policy on Ukraine, he has no real reason to actually reach any kind of peace talks with the Ukrainians. So I think this is one of the many reasons why at the moment there's no hint of any grounds for meaningful negotiations.
And if Putin sees Trump as kind of, I don't know, this light at the edge of the tunnel for this conflict in some way, could we see Russia trying to interfere in the US election in some way to really try and make sure that that happens? I mean, should the US be doing more to prepare for that?
I mean, first of all, we have to realize that when the Russians interfered the first time round, they weren't really trying to get Trump elected so much as trying to undermine Hillary Clinton. I mean, they were sure that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And essentially, they were just trying to create as much trouble for what they thought was going to be the incoming President Clinton by supporting extreme elements on the right and on the left. And Trump just happened to be one of them. And certainly when Trump was elected, I mean, it actually caught the Russians severely by surprise. They didn't quite know how to deal with this. So they probably didn't actually have much of an impact on that election. What they helped to do was just simply stoke up part of the sort of frankly toxic partisan mood that is still very much a feature in America today. So likewise, going into the next election, are they actively going to try and support Trump? I mean, I'm sure they'd love to if they felt they could, but in practice, most of the times they've interfered in elections, not just in the United States, but in Europe and the UK, it's actually proven counterproductive. So I suspect that they're probably not going to sort of try too obvious a campaign. But again, from their point of view, they will just use it as an opportunity to stir up trouble. Because the next best thing to having a supportive president or prime minister or whatever is a country that is so divided, so racked with internal tensions that it basically can't do anything, that is paralyzed by its own troubles. That is really the Russian strategy. It's paralysis rather than trying to influence the results of elections.
You can always read more from Mark Galeotti in the Sunday Times. Go to times.radio/subscribe.